So first I want to tell you, yes, I'm a kitchen gardener. Yes, I'm a realtor, and I'm a volunteer in terms of doing all these workshops. It's my way to contribute to the community and also to share my passion. And this is one of a series of workshops. I do a number of different workshops on gardening, and we've already had one spring workshop. And I also do a series on home and real estate related. And then finally, who knows, I'm thinking about some other series of ways to love life at home. And that's really what's the common thread with my spring vegetable gardening, my summer vegetable gardening, monarchs, garlic. It's just growing. Yes, today's gardening series is very relevant to today. I think we're all feeling pretty constricted, having to stay in place, and for some it's very frustrating, for many it's depressing, but I am not focusing on that element of staying at home. Instead, I'm talking about having a wonderful way to stay at home and enjoy life and see just the wonders of nature and beauty, and to help facilitate that. So I'm hoping to help you find some joy, wonder, and beauty at home through today's workshop. All right, next. All right, so I love this quote: "To grow a garden is to believe in tomorrow." And I think that, again, that's perfect. It's always been my quote for this workshop, but it's especially apropos right now. And here are my promises for today. I'm going to go over the basics to get you started with growing hot crops, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. The how, what, where, when, whys of doing that. Tips and tricks will be interspersed, and I will focus on the miraculous beauty we can create and celebrate. All right, so some housekeeping, some basic things. First of all, if you could please put your full names on your screens, which you can do through Zoom, that would be most useful, because I like to keep track of who actually joins us. And Steve is going to just put a check mark next to your name so I know you are here. Why does it matter? Many of you have already taken a number of my workshops, and that gives me great joy. I'm also a marketer by profession, and so I'm into numbers and stats. And so that's why I like doing it. And I'll also note that about 30% of you have taken my workshops before, so that's pretty exciting. Second of all, I'm going to encourage you to email me. And the reason for emailing me is because I will be sending a presentation summary of the slides. I will send you some recipes for your harvest. I also always do a raffle. It's just my tradition with my workshops. And today, if you look in the bottom corner, right here, you can see we have a jungle growing in my breakfast room. Those are all tomatoes that were started too early in my basement, and they literally are many feet tall. So I'll be giving away some of those, and perhaps some other plants as well that we've grown in our basement. And then for everybody, I will have dill and zinnia seeds available on my front porch. So if you email me, I will give you the details on where to pick those up, and that both the raffle prizes and seeds need to be picked up by end of day Monday. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Oh, by giving me your emails, this is super important. I do not use it for any real estate solicitation. I do sometimes send emails on upcoming workshops or something relevant to a workshop you may have taken. So those, so you know, I never use the emails for promotional purposes, and nor professional solicitations, and I don't share the list with anyone. So you don't have to worry about that. And then finally, The reason I'd love for you to write is to also give me feedback. I think I included a quote at the bottom of this page. It says, gardening both indoors and outdoors has been a welcome ray of optimism during the quarantine, and that was shared by one of my spring gardening participants, who in fact may be on the line right now because I saw his name. Okay, so who am I and how did I get interested in this? Again, I'm Marissa Hopkins, and my first vegetable garden was started when I was 8 years old without my mother's permission. We used to have a swing set in our backyard, and you know how where swings are, they're become divots. Well, I made those divots into maybe a 6-foot by 10-foot square in our backyard without consulting her. Fortunately, my mother's an artist and very creative, and she thought that it was a good idea after I already dug up the sod. So I didn't get in trouble, but that's how early I became interested in growing vegetables. I've always loved plants and planting. In high school, I took horticulture. I never had a desire to become a biologist, but I certainly love plants and horticulture. I started growing vegetables for my family when we lived in Chicago, and we had no room to plant anything. We were on a 25 by 150, we were on a 35 by 125 foot lot, which is slightly oversized for the city, but there wasn't much space for a garden and certainly not much sun. So we used pots and started in pots. Then we moved to Highland Park, where we now have 1/3 of an acre, so we had some room to experiment. So we started in pots again and have sort of expanded throughout the yard. This picture in the corner is our current kitchen garden, which we committed to 3 years ago. And I just want to point out a couple things. And one important thing is, here is actually part of my butterfly garden, which and those are the zinnia, the seeds that, for those of you who choose to come get them, those are the seeds you'll be getting. They're very brightly colored, beautiful, and they grow very tall. So anyway, we made the leap to the kitchen garden, and I have to tell you, gardening for me is truly peaceful enjoyment. I go out there, I see the plants growing, see their progress, and it puts me at peace. I also want to say about vegetable gardening that it really is always an experiment. You never know quite what's going to happen. And it is humbling because it is weather and temperature sensitive. Some of these things are outside of our control, which means one year you might have great tomatoes and the next year you may not. So these are things that are outside of our control, but keeps life interesting. Okay. All right, what are hot crops? Hot crops are the plants we grow in our garden that specifically require heat to thrive. And it's more than thriving, which you'll find out in a moment. And what I mean by heat is it cannot be any less than 50 degrees at night, not during the day, but at night. We are not there yet. Next slide. These are some examples of what are hot crops: basil, cucumbers, eggplants, etc. Next slide. And I'm going to tell you to hold your horses. The plants are in the markets now, but don't plant them outside yet. Next. Here in Chicago, usually we hit that 50-degree mark at night right after Memorial Day or around Memorial Day, and you can watch your weather apps to see when that might be. So why is 50 degrees the magic number? First of all, a lot of the plants we grow are not indigenous to Chicago. They don't grow naturally here. For example, tomatoes are a tropical plant that we have learn to grow here, but they don't like it below 50 degrees. The soil even has to be 50 degrees. Sure, they can survive. If you were to plant it outside, and you see lots of seedlings outside at the grocery stores right now, they'll live as long as there's no frost. But they will show problems when the temperature drops below 50. What kind of problems? Their ability to convert sunlight into sugars, which is essential for their growth. It also reduces their pollen production, which can result in fewer fruits and even fruit deformation. So it's very, very important to wait. Okay. All right, ingredients for success. This is true for all vegetable gardens. Good soil, lots of sun, and I'll be talking about each of these individually. Water, fertilizer, and pollinators. Pollinators are bees, butterflies, birds that enable the flowers to attract them and create the fruits. All right, so let's first talk about soil. It needs to be moisture absorbent, and it's not like you can go out and just plant directly in your soil, especially here because we have a lot of clay, which is very heavy, very dense material that plants don't like to put their roots through, and especially a lot of our plants like carrots and that sort of thing. They love a light, airy soil, and the way that is achieved by adding what are called amendments. And amendments can be things like peat moss, and we also add compost for nutrients. So you can, in terms of your soil, you sort of have 2 or 3 choices. If you're using a container, you really have to use a container mix, which you can either self-mix, which is shown here, or you can buy a prepackaged bag of soil, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But you can also incorporate a garden soil mix into your earth, or again, if you're going to be working directly in the soil in your backyard, you're going to want to amend it and remove any sticky, heavy clay. Ours is about 12 inches down, but there are places where it's probably as close to the surface as 3 or 5 inches. So you could hit it pretty quickly. We've been working our earth where we plant things for some time. So that just happens to be what happens in our particular area, assuming you're all in Highland Park area, North Shore. Okay, sun, second key ingredient in what you need for your garden. These are the minimums you need. Fruiting vegetables, 8 hours of sun. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, melons. Root vegetables need a minimum of 6 hours of sun, and leafy vegetables 4 hours. So that just sort of gives you a general idea, because you're going to have to decide where you're going to be able to do your plantings in your yard. All right. The third ingredient, water. Water is a critical element. It's what nourishes the plants. And you really need to be consistent, especially some plants are more sensitive to that than others, and tomatoes are certainly one of those. Wherever you choose in your yard to put your pots or plant your garden, you need to have water close by, because in the summer you are going to be watering a fair amount. Unlike spring, where nature pretty much does most of the watering for you, in the summer, that's one of our challenges and opportunities, is to get out there and meditate while we're watering the garden. Now, those of you who have a sprinkler system, I'm jealous. All right, so you need to water daily unless it rains. Pots do dry out more quickly than if you're planting in the ground, and you want to ensure that the soil gets saturated. Next. All right, feed me. Plants need fertilizer, they need nutrients, just like we do. There are many different types of fertilizer. You can go to Home Depot or your local gardening shop and find out what is good for what you're growing. All right, so I'm going to be talking about that in one moment on the other side of the screen. But in terms of fertilizer types for green leafy plants, I enjoy, and we often use diluted fish emulsion. There's also something called compost tea. For those of you who compost, you probably know what I'm talking about. It's the liquid that accumulates when you're composting. And finally, there's a commercial fertilizer. Now, what's true with both the fish emulsion and whatever you buy in the store, it's always going to have on the package somewhere 3 numbers. And the 3 numbers always stand for the same thing. The first number in this case is 12. Can you see that? That stands for nitrogen, and nitrogen promotes green leafy growth. Now, you don't always want green leafy growth, whoops, sorry, particularly if you are growing tomatoes. Right now you may, but eventually you won't. Because you don't want all the energy of the tomato going into the leaves. You want it going into the fruits, which is why phosphorus is so important. And you'd want to have that middle number be bigger than the first number, than your nitrogen. And then finally, as you can see, the middle number stands for phosphorus, which is for strong roots and flowers and fruit development. So often on your fruiting vegetables, that middle number is always going to be the biggest. And then finally, potassium is the 3rd number, and that's for overall strength and health. All right, pollinators. I'm not sure how you feel about bees, but bees, hummingbirds, beautiful butterflies are all pollinators, and they're essential for your garden, and you want to attract them. Without them, you wouldn't have fruits, because they need to carry the pollen from flower to flower in order for it to produce fruit. And they're generally drawn to extremely colorful flowers and specific plants. And that's, I will be talking about in my butterfly workshop as to what plants attract what butterflies, and what butterflies what plants certain butterflies have to have in order to survive and continue. And then finally, another use of flowers is to avoid using, oh, sorry, I jumped the gun, is you don't want to use pesticides if you're going to be attracting pollinators, because it'll kill them. So you want to preferably not use commercial pesticides at all in your gardens, and that includes your lawn. That's it. You'll find out more in the butterfly workshop about what attracts butterflies. But in general, you're looking for colorful flowers. And actually in the lower corner is a picture of cut zinnia and dill, and those are all from my butterfly garden. So you can bring them indoors and they're beautiful. Okay. Where to plant? Again, this is what I've been alluding to in terms of the sun and access to water. And those are considerations you have to look at when you're choosing your location. And as you can see in this picture, we've planted in the space between driveways, and that's actually a current picture taken this morning where we have kale and chard planted. Those are cold weather crops, so there are things you can have in the garden right now. You can plant in garden borders, which can be very pretty. And then you also can plant in pots. And this is a picture also taken this morning of my snap peas growing. Your choices are obviously in the earth, in containers, or in raised beds, and I'll touch on those now. All right, in the ground or in the earth. Some people call them earth gardens. Again, you're going to need to prepare the soil because we have all that clay in it. You have the option of just preparing an area for the particular plant in a hole, or you can plant in rows, or in another option is raised beds. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then if you're going to plant in the earth near your house, I'm just going to give you one minor warning. If you're in an older home built pre-1978, there could be lead in your soil from chipping paint going into the earth in the area close to your home. So you may want to consider pots, raised beds, or testing your soil before doing that. All right, raised beds. This picture is actually taken at the Botanic Garden, which will hopefully open again soon. They have an amazing whole island of vegetables and fruits. They have raised beds, and they actually have two kinds. These are the ones that are close to the ground, but they also have ones that are much higher in their accessibility garden. So there are actually two benefits to raised beds. One is that you still can control the soil like you can in a pot, meaning you know there's not lead in it when you buy it commercially. It does contain the plants. It's great because you can walk around them, and if they are high, they're accessible. So someone who's in a wheelchair, or as we age, it's not as easy to bend down and crawl around in the grass and ground. So having raised beds makes gardening something we can do our whole life. Pots. This is for those of you who are brand new to this, this is probably the best way to start because you can start with one pot. It's very manageable. You can put it anywhere, especially if you're sun limited. You know the soil is safe and clean. You're raised above the critters who might interfere with your plants or harvest, especially strawberries. The chipmunks love my strawberries. And you can do multiple plantings in them over the course of a growing season, starting in spring, moving through summer, and then actually into autumn gardens as well, all for vegetables. All right, so what's the right container? When you're choosing a container, the rule of thumb is the bigger the plant, the bigger the container you're going to need. If you use too small of a pot, it could cause a problem because it could constrain the yield. The plant may not produce because it becomes root bound. And if it's too small, like for a tomato, and not stable enough, it could fall over, and you don't want your pots falling over. Smaller pots do require more frequent watering too, but you don't always have to use a big pot. We'll come back to those in a second, but a shallow pot is fine for beans and arugula and things like shallow root plants, but you really need a deep pot, and I'll show you what we use for tomatoes. This is a 18-inch deep pot. You can see how big it is. It's probably bigger. I think it's maybe 21. I'm probably lying, about 18. And it's about a 20 to 25 gallon pot for the soil. And you'll see that that is how soil is measured. It's basically, I think that soil bag I showed you of potting mix was 50 pounds, and you need about 1.5 of those. At Costco, I just bought that for $7.99, so that's how much the soil cost me. Root vegetables, you also need a deep pot because you want them to grow deep, and again, you want it to be a very loamy soil with a lot of air in it so they can grow deep and beautifully shaped. All right, container options. Probably the drainage issue is debatable, but, well, maybe not, but I'll tell you what in a minute. You do want drainage in your pots because if we have a lot of rain, I feel that you don't want your plants to flood. And That's very important. But you want the pot to be big enough and with enough dirt so it will also hold moisture. But if it gets overwatered, that's why you need holes in the bottom of your pot. Unless you have a self-watering pot, and that you'll have to learn more about at a greenhouse or a garden center. They're delightful. I love them, but they're more expensive. And you don't have to go out and buy pots. You can also use found pots, recycled pots. I have some examples in the bottom corner. You can make them yourself out of clay. You can use a 5-gallon bucket. You have many options. So don't let going out and buying a $15 to, I've seen pots that cost over $100 that are ceramic and very decorative. These particular plastic pots here, these are what I was just showing you. They're on sale, or were last week, for $14.99 at Costco, but full price was $18.99. And then just one more comment about plastic versus ceramic is that plastic, obviously it's lighter, easier to use. I couldn't possibly lift this pot if it were ceramic. And they get even heavier, obviously, with soil. So you're not going to be moving around a big pot like this, plastic or ceramic. But one benefit to ceramic is that it holds heat. And for those heat-loving plants, peppers, again, tropical plant, they love ceramic pots because it holds in the heat. All right, annuals versus perennials. We're starting to talk about plant choices now. Generally, what I'm primarily talking about are plants that are called annuals. Their whole life cycle is one season. They start with a seed, they produce a plant, they fruit, and then they die. It's over. They're not coming back next year. So even if you bought it as a small plant, it's still the same life cycle. There are plants that do come back every year, perennials. I can't think, asparagus would be a vegetable that comes back every year, but mostly it's fruits like the grapes, apples, fruit trees, that sort of thing. Strawberries, they come back every year. All right, seeds versus seedlings. There are a lot of plants that you can just start by seed, just pop them in the ground and you're good to go. And in fact, some of these I've never seen sold as plants, like, small plants that you can just put in the ground. And that would be like carrots, beets, beans, green beans, wax beans, pole beans. You want to read the packet for instructions, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a moment. The other benefit to buying seeds versus seedlings is that you have a much broader variety of types of plants you can get. And what I mean by that is within the world of tomatoes, for example, we're all now pretty familiar with heirloom, a crim, a rainbow. Those are pretty common now. You can find them in grocery stores, but there's a whole world out there of many, many, many more tomatoes in all different shapes and sizes. And if you start them from seed, you have a lot more choice. Not necessarily at the stores here, but there are garden specialty stores, and there's a co-op in Iowa where you can get all sorts of heirlooms. In terms of buying seedlings, those actually are also necessary because, for example, tomatoes, if we were to plant seeds on Memorial Day, we would not have tomatoes this season. They need to get a jump on the season, and so they are longer growing plants, and as you know, they need heat. So there's certain plants you have to start as little plants, and I would put tomatoes, eggplants, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower into that category. Some people do start chard and kale directly in the ground, and you can, but we're already producing those and eating them. So it's a benefit to start them inside, put them out in the spring, and you are already enjoying your vegetables. The other thing about plants, I'm trying to see if there's anything I need to tell you. Oh, yes, if you're going to buy these hot weather plants, these hot crops now, don't put them outside. Keep them in your house until we have those 50-degree nights. Even though they're selling them, you don't want to put them in the ground yet. All right, seeds. Actually, this is true for seeds and plants. You always need to know how and when to plant. So where do you get that information? For seeds, you get it on the back of the package. And you can see here, I've identified the type of information you can expect. Is it consistent? No, never. It's never consistent. But you know what to look for. Or hopefully, once you see this slide and have it at home, you'll know what to look for. You always need to know the sun requirements. And in this case, I don't recall, oh, this is lettuce and it says full sun. You want to know days to harvest. Lettuce is a very quick growing plant. It's only for the spring and fall, which is good that it's fast growing. And in this case, it's 45 days. You want to know the depth to plant the seeds, the thinning distance, which I'll touch on in a moment, and the planting instructions often say when to expect to see the seedlings and when they'll produce. When to plant is obviously critical because if you don't remember, and it can vary from seed to seed, the package should tell you. Now, obviously on a plant, you don't need as much information if it's already in a pot, but you do need the sun requirement and the instructions. They're always on the tag or often on the packaging. And if you happen to buy a plant that doesn't have it, put it back and get one that does. Next. Oh, here, Seed Savers Exchange. I have written on the bottom. That's the fabulous resource in Iowa where you can get seeds of all sorts of varieties and vegetables of every color, shape, and size you can possibly imagine, from purple beans to, I don't know, purple tomatoes. All right, thinning plants. This pertains to seeds. Often when you plant seeds, the instructions will say, you know, just put them an inch apart, but then thin them down to, say, every 5 inches. So what you can see in this picture over here is these were planted probably roughly an inch apart, but however, you're going to want to thin them so that they get to grow to their mature size. For example, a head of lettuce. And they won't do that if they feel too squished. So here you can see, this was actually in the winter. I mean, in the fall, we had snow. This is how it looks when you plant them, and then this is how it looks when you thin them. In a big pot like the one I showed you, we generally grow 6 heads of lettuce. Or I'm trying to think, that would be like 6 or so green bean plants. Again, you'll have to look at what the instructions say. So you want to space per the directions. When you thin, you want to try and get them while they're a single root and not intertwined in each other. So that's usually when they have 2 to 4 leaves, which is about where these are right now. And you pinch them. Now, obviously, if they were like this, you can also eat them. And you can either, when I say pinch, literally pinch like this with your fingernails, or cut them with the scissors, because you generally don't want to pull them out because it can disturb the plants next to them and you don't want to damage them. And then finally, if you're super careful with like a teaspoon, I've been known to dig out a few and put them in other pots because I want to not waste them, but you don't need to do that. All right, tomatoes. This is one of the reasons people grow hot crops, because tomatoes, there's nothing like homegrown tomatoes. The stores can't come close. The only people who can are at the farmer's market. Tomatoes grow very big, they're viney, They will need to be staked, either with wood stakes or big, heavy tomato baskets. So you want to make sure whatever you use is very strong and secure. You want to carefully keep the tomatoes contained and lifted up off the ground. What I use are old nylon stockings to tie the veins. Now, I don't know if anyone has nylon stockings anymore, but I have some from quite a few years back that I never used. That would also include tights. And I literally cut the fabric. And the reason I use that is because it's very flexible and it won't damage the vine as it grows. With tomatoes, even consistent watering is critical, or you can run into some problems. Once they start producing, you can actually harvest them daily. And you'll want to keep an eye on them so that you don't miss that opportunity. And so it's a progressive harvest. The small cherries like Sweet 100s, or the small cherry tomatoes, which you can see right here. By the way, this is a crim, which is probably something you have seen in your grocery stores. But here's a medium-sized yellow tomato, and I don't remember what that one is. Do you? No. Okay. Anyway, that was a question to Dan. But here you can see are the cherry tomatoes, and those ripen soonest, and all summer long you can just go out and pop them in your mouth as you're gardening. So for me, when I choose tomatoes, I like to have the broadest variety of color, size, shape, and taste. All right, basil. Most people don't know that basil is a hot weather crop. It's very important not to put it out yet. To keep basil going, it's actually a plant that once you plant it through roughly early September, you can keep harvesting. And actually, the more you harvest it, the fuller the plant gets. So if it's not quite full yet and ready to harvest, you can pinch back. I'm not sure if you can see this lower picture. I've sort of noted places where you'd want to pinch. You always want to leave some leaves on the bottom, but sometimes you can harvest a long stem. And this would be just like, say you're doing a tomato salad tonight. There's nothing better than going out and getting fresh garlic from your backyard. But on the other hand, once your plant starts getting this big, which can happen in roughly a month, you will want to start harvesting. And again, you need to leave foliage on the bottom, but you want to be pretty aggressive. It'll look a little leggy initially, but it will fill in fast. It's amazing how quickly it fills in. If you don't harvest, the plant will eventually start losing leaves, get very leggy, turn yellow, it'll be all flowery, and you won't get a second or third harvest out of it. So it actually helps the plant for you to pinch it back. And we've gotten 3 harvests. I think I had a silly picture in the beginning of me with just 1 pot's worth of harvest. I don't know if you remember that. It was with my name. That was 1 harvest from 1 pot. And we only do 2 pots, and that's actually what's shown here. For pesto, you can use the leaves, the flowers, and the tender stems. You basically put them in a food processor. One thing I want to tell you, the expensive thing about pesto, this is a tip. I don't use pine nuts. I actually use walnuts, and it tastes great. You can also freeze pesto very easily. Obviously, having fresh basil at home, you can use as a beautiful garnish. We also grind it up, add water, and freeze it in ice cube trays, so you can add fresh basil to your cooking all winter long and beyond. So by having it in ice cube trays, you can throw it in soup, you can do whatever, you just keep it frozen and it's accessible all winter long. As summer wanes, the plants will start to yellow and start dropping leaves. It's time to harvest because you're about to lose your whole plant. I usually do leave 2 plants just so I have a few leaves I can draw on for my tomatoes, which are still going, for my tomato salads. And so that's what I do. When I mean 2 plants, there's a lot more than 2 plants in one of these pots. We probably have easily, how many, 10? A dozen to 15 individual plants that are in that one pot. All right, flowers, as I mentioned before, critical for the pollinators, but flowers have all sorts of benefits besides attracting pollinators. There are flowers that help with pest control. Marigolds are one of those. That's here on the bottom. They're also edible. These nasturtium, people will put in salads. Same with Johnny jump ups, which are right here. And in the olden days, they used to actually, and maybe even today, you can treat them with sugar and use them on cakes as decorations. So flowers are a critical element in the garden. Next. All right, harvesting tips. 1, lettuce is not a summer plant. You can grow it in the spring, you can grow it in the fall. If you haven't harvested it and it's starting to get hot, get it in the shade and hopefully you'll still be able to enjoy it before it gets bitter. Lettuce gets very bitter in heat, and it also does something called bolting, which is where it shoots out a flower, and it can happen in a day. You're not going to want to eat it anyway because it's too bitter. With green and wax beans, you've really got to stay on top of those. The more you harvest them, the more they're going to flower and produce. And also, if you leave them on too long, they get real stringy and yucky. Root vegetables, you can actually harvest as needed. You don't have to take all the beets out at once, but you don't want to leave them in for a month because then they'll get woody. So there are a number of tricks with those. Herbs and kale and broccoli. Those are plants that can go all season. Broccoli, some people just believe, you know, once you grow that big head, it's time to get rid of the plant. Well, I'm not in that school at all. Once you have the big, beautiful head, of course, we harvest it, but then we let the plant continue to grow. And what happens is it keeps sending out little flowers that, of course, look like broccoli, and that's when you want to harvest them, and that's what broccolini is. They may become flowers. You want to make sure and take those off, and it'll grow into a big bush that you can keep harvesting well in past the first frost. Same with Brussels sprouts and kale. With kale, if you harvest from the bottom up, same with chard versus taking the whole plant. You can just keep harvesting all season long. And in the case of kale and Brussels sprouts, they actually taste better after a frost and can take snow and freeze. And we've had kale until easily November, December, and Brussels sprouts I've left outside longer than that and took them when I needed them. They do freeze, but they taste fine when you cook them. Chives all season. Green tomatoes, this is a tip. Right before you know the first freeze is coming, harvest your green tomatoes. Take them all off the plants and save them. You can do one of 2 things. You can let them ripen. They don't taste the same, but they're good for canning or freezing. Or there are many, many green tomato recipes. I have a huge collection because one season we had 300 pounds of green tomatoes. And so we made a lot of green tomato things, green tomato cake, green tomato soup. You get the gist. All right. So here you can see one of our favorite things is the fresh tomato salad. I can have it every night with mozzarella, with your fresh basil, with fresh chives. We even have some of our peppers in there. But as you can also see here, this green tomato is a zebra tomato. It's supposed to be green when it's ripe. So that is no mistake. And this is eggplant parmesan. So cultivate the power of plants to sustain and enrich life. Next. We're almost done. Closing thoughts, start small. If you run into disease and pests, Google it. Google the questions and inevitably you'll find the answer. Do try growing new and unusual things. It makes it all the more worthwhile and satisfying to try new things. Remember, nature is nature. Some things may do well one year and not the next. And finally, enjoy the beauty and flavor. Next. And here are 2 upcoming workshops. I was actually going to change this name, but dare not, from Majestic Monarchs to Mysterious Monarchs, because they're actually migrating butterflies, which is a whole story that's amazing and wonderful. And they're in jeopardy. So I will be talking about the marvelous, mysterious monarchs in my butterfly workshop, but also butterfly gardens in general, what to grow, what the caterpillars need, etc. And that'll be Wednesday, May 13th, which is next week, between 1 and 2. So do register for that. And then in the fall, I'll be doing a workshop calling Gorgeous Garlic Grown at Home. And garlic is a whole separate plant that's very amazing and wonderful and diverse and fun to grow, easy to grow, but it takes planning because you don't grow it until plant it in the fall and harvest it in July the following year. Next. All right. This just says stay in touch. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. Share your success, post it on Loving Life on the North Shore.